I am Sarah Eggy, and I am the Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History, and I have been at Center for 10 years.
I'm Dr. Jamie Shenton, and I am Associate Professor of Anthropology.
I'm Dr. Jeffrey Shenton. I'm Assistant Professor of Anthropology.
My name's Lenny Demoranville, and I am an Associate Professor of Chemistry here at Center College.
My name is Brian Casado. I am Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Neuroscience. Been at the college for 17 years.
Primary sources are historians' bread and butter, or meat and potatoes, or whatever other food you want to think of. It is the essential component of our research. We look to primary sources to tell us about the past, and they really make our research what it is. They really are the way that we tell our stories. They're the voices that we use from the past to illuminate the questions we have about ourselves today. So my first book project was on women's suffrage, and so I looked at a lot of church records, minute books of federated women's clubs, newspapers, because these are the places where women's voices were. There's of course government documents and other political papers, because the right to vote was a political issue. In history, pretty much anything could be a primary source, anything from the past that tells you something about wherever it came from, whatever it's about, whoever it's about. I brought a little visual aid as an example. This is a cookbook, but recipes are really what I thought of as something that people don't often think of as a primary source. But recipes tell you a lot. It tells you obviously what people ate, but it tells you about what ingredients might have been available in a place, so environment. It can tell you about how people prepared, so what kind of equipment they had, how were kitchens, how were they arranged. They can tell you a lot about gender, because often women were doing the cooking, also race, depending on a place where maybe women of color were doing most of the cooking. It tells you how influences, whether they're ethnic or racial or otherwise, class, how did people at elite levels eat versus people of the lower class. So recipes are fantastic.
So classically, data is generated in anthropology through fieldwork, usually long-term fieldwork. Purely qualitative research is observational and descriptive in nature. So it involves using the self as a lens to observe and absorb a context, and then to attempt to both document that and also then to see patterns in what you are observing, and in seeing those patterns then attempts to describe them. The way that that takes form in an actual written work is really variable in anthropology. It can take the form of quotes from interviews, it can be observational in nature and descriptive in nature, it can be textual, it can be multimedia, it can be a lot of different things depending on the context, which can itself be really varied.
I think anthropology is super interdisciplinary. We're very omnivorous. We look for information in many different places. You know, as far as other kinds of evidence you can look at. I mean, especially in my field work, right? I'm looking at Twitter, right? I'm looking at news feeds, I'm looking at cartoons, I'm looking at all sorts of things that I see as relevant representations of what's going on in the world. Another thing that we like to say is that nothing is really not an anthropological problem, you know, because we're the science of humanity. Really everything is under our purview, and we're interested in it. And so I think, again, the kinds of things that we look at in order to explore the dimensions of what it means to be human, past and present and into the future, are going to be super variable.
Primary sources in the discipline of chemistry are journal articles, and they are primarily written to report on a very specific experiment that has been done, reporting new data that's been collected in a lab, maybe something like this, in order to report the results of whatever test, experiment, hypothesis that we were working on.
So there's been an evolution in primary sources in psychology and neuroscience within my career. So peer-reviewed journal articles have always been the definitive source of information in neuroscience and experimental psychology. And over time, That has migrated from paper journals to online journals. The journal article, the journals that I'm used to frequenting are now online. The Journal of Comparative Psychology, Behavior and Brain Sciences, international journals of neuroscience. There's also a whole lot of other information about neuroscience, behavior in the brain, effects of behavior, that's also available online, that I would categorize as pop psychology.
Papers in chemistry generally have, not always in this order, but often in something like this order, they'll have an abstract, which is a really short description of what happened in the paper. They'll have an introduction, which has the background of what the paper is. They'll have a method section that will explain what was done. They'll have a results section that just presents the data that you collect. They'll have a discussion section that then talks about all of that data and what it means, and then maybe a conclusion section, which is often really, really short and really summarizes what was discovered in the paper.
So if you're reading about an experiment or an experimental finding, you want to be reading about that finding from the person that actually did the research.
Knowing how to use those journal articles really sets the foundation for whatever you're going to do in the future, right? I cannot possibly teach all of the chemistry content that is available in the world today. I think for me, the example I use, even though it's not a chemistry example, is the example of CRISPR. When I was in college, CRISPR didn't exist. Now it is one of the biggest, most important technologies that's being used in the biology field. And my professors couldn't think about teaching me that because they didn't know. So they were really teaching me, and I'm teaching my students, the skills to be able to understand whatever the next thing is, because science is always developing, growing, changing. And so learning the skills of how to read and get just the right information, right? Sometimes I'm reading a journal article and I need to really read the whole thing. Sometimes it's that they used a procedure that I want to use, and really all I care about is the method section, and that's what I'm going to use. And so how do I pick the pieces that I actually want? That's important. How do I get immersed in a new field? That's important.
Because the secondary source, I don't know if you can pick up all of these books here, but primary versus secondary sources, the secondary source is summarizing what we already know. The primary source, these journal articles, the experimentation, is actually discovering something new. That's something that you have discovered that is not in any secondary source. You can't get that information from reading. You have to get it from doing. And then once the doing is finished, you write about what you did and about why what you found is unique. And I think helping students understand the importance of reading primary literature is in making that distinction. Now you're not relying on someone else to tell you what's important to read. You have found a source of information that is coming directly from the researcher herself or himself.
Right, so one of the things that I say to them is that your claim is only as big as your data. But a lot of times I think undergraduates, we have super smart students here, and so they make big claims because they have big ideas, right? And I think in general, sometimes when you make a big claim, you can't necessarily substantiate it in the way that you need to with the kind of evidence that you have. And so it's really important to know how to reasonably use the evidence that you have and only say the things that you can say based on the kinds of information that you actually have.
Taking a vast amount of information, trying to understand it, and then trying to distill it and explain it to someone. There is no career that skill is not important. To being able to express yourself, to be able to prove what it is you mean and claim and why. Historians, we ask why and how all the time. And so for me, those are things that an employer is going to ask of you, or a colleague, coworker, and for you to be able to explain that, to take the evidence and build that in, and make your case in writing or in a presentation or whatever, that's essential.